museum and our director, Claude Barabee. Let me welcome you to Carvel Hall for what I think is going to be a fascinating lecture today on the history of Carvel Hall, which a lot of us have heard of, some of us have seen, and some of us haven't. Our speaker is Glenn Campbell. Some of you may not know it, he's a Naval Academy graduate, class of '86. He went into the Navy as a P3 NFO, spent 8 years in the service, and then he came back here and taught history. He was just coming into the history department when I was just leaving the history department. We went like that. And since, I don't know how many years you taught here, several,
yeah,
after
close enough.
Several years, he has joined Historic Annapolis. And so, on behalf of everybody, let me welcome our speaker, Glenn Campbell.
All right, well, thank you, Grant. Thanks for the invitation to come and speak here. This is part of a series that the Naval Academy Museum and my organization, Historic Annapolis, started up this spring. And so this is the last in our lecture series, but hopefully we might start them up again come fall. So why am I talking about a hotel here at the Naval Academy? Well, Carvel Hall Hotel had a very important role in the life of the community of Annapolis, and also had a very important role in the social life of the Naval Academy, such as it was during much of the 20th century. So I'm really focusing on the overall history of the site and the role it played, both in the community as a whole and then its connections with the Academy. For much of the 20th century, the William Paca House, home of a signer of the Declaration of Independence and Maryland's third state governor, was part of a hotel called Carvel Hall. Carvel Hall was described in a hotel brochure from about 1960 as a showplace of colonial charm in the heart of Annapolis. And so that's my subtitle today, Carvel Hall, a showplace of colonial charm. Carvel Hall was the city's largest and best hotel for 6 decades. It was an integral part of the Annapolis community and Naval Academy's social life. Its history and the stories of the people associated with it reflect broader themes of local and even national history. It reflects the growing colonial revival interest in the nation's past in the early 20th century. It shows some tension in Annapolis between development and preservation impulses and interests. It shows the growing appeal of sports and entertainment in popular culture. Carvel Hall figured in both areas. And it also shows changing racial roles and relationships throughout the 20th century. Oh, let's see, here it is. These are all the owners of the hotel from the time it was purchased in 1901 until it closed down in 1965. I'm going to focus on a few of the individuals rather than the different periods of ownership so much. So these are the few individuals I really want to focus in on. The founder of the hotel was a guy named William Larned, and then members of his extended family were later owners or managers of the hotel, Albert and Elizabeth McCarthy and Willis Armbruster. And then one gentleman, Marcellus Hall, was associated with the hotel from 1913 until it closed in 1965. Marcellus Hall was an African-American staff member who really started at the bottom of the hotel and worked his way up, and who became the public face of the hotel for much of its very long life. At the end of the 19th century, the city block defined by King George Street, Martin Street, East Street, Prince George Street, and Maryland Avenue was still dominated by 3 colonial-era mansions. The Hammond Harwood House up here at the corner of King George and Maryland Avenue. Just for point of reference, we're sort of a block in from Gate 3 here. So it was dominated by Hammond Harwood House, the William Paca House, and the James Bryce House. There had been some later infill construction along Prince George Street and a little bit on Maryland Avenue, but it was still largely undeveloped at the end of the 19th century. At the end of the 19th century, the Pea House was owned by Elizabeth Swan, who was the widow of Richard Swan, and it was managed by trustee John Wirt Randall. The Pea House had become essentially a glorified boarding house. It was divided into two main properties. The wing house was this section over on the west side, the west wing and the west hyphen, and that was rented for almost 20 years by Robert and Julia Bowie. The central block of the house and the east wing and hyphen were rented by Dr. Stephen and Mary Kennedy. And Mary Kennedy essentially rented out individual rooms in the central block of the house to individuals or to families. The Pea House was bought by William Larned for $15,000 on December 1st, 1901. Larned had an ambitious plan to turn this ailing old rental property into the heart of a grand new hotel that he envisioned in Annapolis. Now, Carvel Hall was named for the home of the fictitious title character in the novel Richard Carvel, an 1899 best-selling novel about colonial and revolutionary Annapolis. The book was authored by the American Winston Churchill, a U.S. Naval Academy graduate from 1894, not the British Prime Minister of later fame. Now, the man who purchased the Paca property in 1901, William Larned, was from Summit, New Jersey. He had studied engineering at Cornell University, where he was national intercollegiate tennis champion. He served with Teddy Roosevelt's Rough Riders during the Spanish-American War and later on in the Army Signal Corps during World War I. He suffered from rheumatism while in Cuba, and this caused later health problems for him. Larned was a friend of Ernest Flagg, the architect who redesigned and rebuilt the Naval Academy campus beginning in the late 1890s. Larned came to Annapolis to assist with Flagg's rebuilding project here on the yard. His father, a New York lawyer and land developer, asked him to look for potential hotel sites convenient to the growing academy. Basically, the thinking is the academy is getting bigger, more midshipmen, more moms and dads and girlfriends and little brothers and sisters coming to visit. What a great place for a hotel. So William Larned buys the property in 1901 and starts developing it. When he purchased the property, Bill Larned was reigning national tennis champion, having won what is now the U.S. Open tennis tournament that past summer. He won 6 more national titles and reached the quarterfinals at Wimbledon both times he entered. He was on 5 winning Davis Cup teams, but rheumatoid arthritis forced him to retire from tennis in 1911. Larned originally planned a 60-room hotel addition connected to the back of the William Paca House. But by the time Carvel Hall opened in 1903, it had been expanded to 120 guest rooms in a C-shaped building with an open courtyard facing King George Street. So now we see the Paca House here on Prince George Street with this C-shaped hotel addition off the back. Again, about 120 rooms originally. There was a guest parlor and a dining room on the first floor of the eastern arm. The low-lying ground that had once been the wilderness area of William Paca's garden was filled in with dirt carted over from work sites at the Naval Academy. So this shows the hotel in 1903, 1908, and then this is the view of the hotel that you would see as you were entering it from the King George Street side. So this whole space here, which had been this low-lying marshy area during William Paca's time and for much of the 19th century, that was all leveled off with fill. Where's it coming from? The yard. As they're excavating for Bancroft Hall and other buildings, the dirt is going in the back of carts and it's going over and filling in that space. When we did archaeology on the Paca site in the 1960s and 70s, they were always finding naval buttons and insignia, and we're wondering how did all this stuff get there? And they finally figured out, well, it's just being carted from inside the wall to outside the wall. The rear porch, or the tower room of the Paca House, was partially dismantled to allow access to this new addition, but there were no major changes to the Prince George Street facade of the old Paca House. So here you can see the house. It has, by this point, had some additional floors added on in the 1890s here, but that you can see just a little glimpse of the Carvel Hall Hotel Addition peeking off to the side there. A portico was built over the main front door. That was another alteration to the front here. And eventually 2 small bays were built against the east wing of the house to buttress a wall that was bowing out due to that 1890s expansion work. Basically, this wall started to fail, and so they had to build something against it to keep it from toppling over. The Pea House parlor was used as the guest sitting room in Carvel Hall, and the hall and dining room of the old house functioned as the check-in counter with staff office space behind. The second floor bed chambers of the Pea House became guest rooms of the hotel. Many early color postcards show the Pea House during its life as part of Carvel Hall Hotel. The hotel emphasized its connection to the glory days of colonial Annapolis. There were often more references to the fictional character Richard Carvel and George Washington, who didn't dance or sleep here, as far as we know, than to William Paca, the builder of the house himself. So here we see Carvel Hall, oldest house in Annapolis. Well, no, not quite. Built about 1770. Well, they're at least within 10 years there. That's not too bad. George and Martha Washington danced in this house. Not that we know of. Washington kept very detailed diaries of his visits to Annapolis, never once mentioned dancing or sleeping here. And then I like this one here. This was the home of Richard Carvel, some visitor writes home. That would be like, going to Washington today and buying a postcard of the White House, and then on the back, writing to your loved ones back home, this is the home of President Frank Underwood. From House of Cards. They're just kind of not getting it right here. In February 1907, ownership of Carvel Hall was transferred to the Security Land Company, which was a Larned family-owned business. Now, William Larned's personal story ended rather tragically. On top of his rheumatoid arthritis, he later became partially paralyzed by spinal meningitis and was unable to pursue his very active lifestyle. Suffering from depression, he committed suicide at Manhattan's exclusive Knickerbocker Club in December 1926, 2 months after his family corporation sold the hotel. Now, Carvel Hall had been open for 10 years when a young African-American man named Marcellus Hall began working there as a bellboy on the 12th of October, 1913. Marcellus Hall had graduated from St. Emma's Industrial and Agricultural School in Virginia with academic and vocational training. He took what he thought would be a temporary job and wound up staying his entire career. He worked his way up to become the indispensable jack of all trades and superintendent of services for the hotel. He became the embodiment of Carvel Hall hospitality and the public face of the largely African-American staff that worked behind the scenes. Around the end of World War I, Carvel Hall was enlarged by the construction of a 5-story addition to the north end of the eastern arm. So this was built right here, late 19-teens. There was a grill room and a ballroom on the first floor, another dining room on the second floor, and guest rooms on the 3rd to 5th floors. And there was now also parking and also garage services for guests' cars. And this is now what the hotel looked like as you were coming from the King George Street side. Originally, there's that balanced facade that we saw in the earlier photographs, and here now we have this new addition sort of jutting out a little bit further than the other side. You have some nice mature trees now growing up along this walkway. And then here's the garages off to the side of the parking lot. Carvel Hall's role as the social center of the Naval Academy began attracting the attention of Hollywood. The 1925 movie The Midshipmen, starring Latin lover Ramon Navarro, had scenes filmed at the hotel. The 1935 film Shipmates Forever starred Dick Powell as the lounge-singing son of a career Navy man who goes to the academy just to prove to his father he's not a bum. Predictably, he gets the lead girl and becomes a hero. And here's Dick Powell posing in front of Carvel Hall with his very nice car. The 1937 movie Annapolis Salute starred James Ellison and Marcia Hunt. In this film, which had scenes at Carvel Hall, Marcellus Hall had a cameo role as himself. And here's Marcellus on the Carvel Hall stairway, telling the young midshipman, played by Mr. Ellison, that he cannot go upstairs unchaperoned to see Miss Hunt's character. That was strictly forbidden. In the movie, Ellison's character slips Hall some money to let him pass, but in reality, Marcellus Hall says he always maintained a very vigilant watch for sneaky midshipmen. In 2005, Annapolitan Ed Weber recalled his experiences working as a movie extra. He wrote, "I remember very well how the bar and cocktail lounge was the after-work meeting place for principals and underlings for motion picture companies when they were filming in the nearby Naval Academy. It was back in the 30s when Marcia Hunt and James Ellison came to Annapolis to make the movie Annapolis Salute. We local guys who were old enough to be extras as midshipmen jumped at the opportunity to earn $5 a day merely for wearing a Navy uniform and being filmed in the June ball scene, along with pretty girls who had been hired for the same purpose. Of course, once we had faced the Klieg lights, we thought that we belonged to the actors group. This manifested itself one late afternoon when the stars and others gathered in the Carvel Hall bar for a little rest and relaxation. It turned into a good party as tables were moved together and the intensity of good feelings escalated. It soon became just one big happy family. As the evening wore on, camaraderie became the order of the day and a good time was being had by all. There was much storytelling and joking. All was well until someone told a good joke which drew guffaws from all except for one local fellow who shall remain nameless because of his family standing in the community. He took exception to the joke because of Miss Hunt's presence and because of the other ladies who were present. To emphasize his point, Charlie Sherman, this is now 2 sentences after he says, I'm not going to say his name because of his family, but anyway, to emphasize his point, Charlie Sherman grabbed a seltzer bottle and soaked the storyteller and exclaimed at the same time, "You can't talk like that in front of a lady." Marcellus quickly interceded and brought calm to the partygoers. Charlie was told to leave the lounge and the party continued. Now, meanwhile, William Barce, a New York hotel manager, bought Carvel Hall in October 1926. This is now, again, 2 months before William Larned's suicide. But the Great Depression hit, and Barce defaulted on his mortgage, and Security Land Company reassumed ownership and management of the property in 1932. The president of the Security Land Company was Albert or Mac McCarthy. McCarthy grew up in Ames and Des Moines, Iowa. He graduated from the academy in 1897 and served 10 years active duty, including service during the Spanish-American War. He married Bill Larned's sister, Elizabeth, or Bess, or Bessie as she was known, in 1905, and the couple bought a ranch in British Columbia. Bess McCarthy was just as athletic as her tennis champion brother, and she got interested in mountaineering while living out in Western Canada. Both McCarthys became expert climbers, with Mac completing numerous first ascents of Canadian peaks, including Mount Robeson, the highest in the Canadian Rockies in 1913, and Mount Logan, the highest in Canada and the second highest in North America in 1925. The McCarthys sold their ranch in 1930 and moved to Colorado, and then to Annapolis to take on management of Carvel Hall in 1932. The McCarthys were among the leaders of Annapolis's early preservation group called the Company for the Restoration of Colonial Annapolis. The CRCA was incorporated in a January 1936 dinner meeting in Carvel Hall. The Company for the Restoration of Colonial Annapolis consulted with key figures from colonial Williamsburg, including Dr. W.A.R. Goodwin, the clergyman who inspired John D. Rockefeller Jr. to finance the Virginia town's restoration and reconstruction. And this photograph down here shows Dr. Goodwin, the guy who came up with the idea of restoring Williamsburg. Here's Admiral Sellers, superintendent of the Naval Academy at the time, and here's Mac McCarthy standing in the back here, but all prominent local citizens in this group. The CRCA commissioned a map and photographs of historic properties in Annapolis and a beautification plan for City Dock. The group protected threatened historic buildings and had an office in the Hammond Harwood house where it conducted limited tours of the property. The CRCA had an appreciation for the real history of Carvel Hall, as shown in this postcard by CRCA founder Mary Craven Johnson. It's no longer Richard Carvel's house. It's no longer a place where George and Martha danced and dined and slept, but now it's truly Governor Paca's house, built 1763, an accurate date, now Carvel Hall. And this is actually a very accurate rendering of what we think the house looked like in the 18th century. Even after the company went dormant in 1939, the McCarthys continued to support Annapolis preservation efforts. In 1940, when the Hammond Harwood House Association was trying to raise $45,000 to buy the house from St. John's College, Mac McCarthy was treasurer of the county fundraising committee, and Carvel Hall donated the first $250 to the campaign. Later, he was on the board of Historic Annapolis and left $10,000 in his will to go toward restoration projects. By 1937, the McCarthys wanted to step back from daily management of Carvel Hall. They invited their niece Laura and her husband Willis Armbruster to come from Iowa to look over the hotel and consider taking on the job. Willis Armbruster wrote about his first visit to Annapolis and to Carvel Hall in 1937. He said, "We spent 2 days in Annapolis, days that were filled to overflowing. We saw the hotel from top to bottom. We visited every department. We delved into the intricacies of kitchens and storerooms. We were appalled at the magnitude of the housekeeper's responsibilities, with its linen rooms, repair shops, and supply centers. We visited the domain of the chief engineer and marveled at the equipment necessary just to supply the essentials of heat, light, and water. So this was a hotel. Actually, it was a combination of a dozen different businesses all rolled into one." The Armbrusters decided to take the job, and they moved their family east. But soon, within a few months, they faced their first crisis. And this was a fire that occurred in November 1937, started in the hotel by defective wiring. Almost 100 residents and guests escaped uninjured. Navy boxing coach Spike Webb, who lived at the hotel full-time, lost many of his Olympic trophies and his scrapbook from the games. The fire was put under control in 90 minutes, but it took 4 hours to put it out completely. The top floors of the hotel addition were destroyed. Water poured through the ceilings and stood several inches deep on the lowest floor. Fortunately, the Pea House itself suffered only minor water damage. The McCarthys and the Armbrusters oversaw the redesign and rebuilding of the hotel wing after the fire. The arms of the addition were balanced once again, and the courtyard was closed in. A large portico was built over the entrance on the King George Street side, and more parking spaces were added on the former site of William Paca's garden. And for locals who remember Carvel Hall, this is what they remember. Murals by Jack Manley Rosé were installed in the old Annapolis tap room in 1943. Rosé was from Summit, New Jersey. He was a close family friend of the McCarthys. He was an illustrator for periodicals, and he had done a book on Williamsburg written by his wife, Grace. Jack Rosé spent over a year working with Willis Armbruster to ensure the accuracy of the murals that he put up in Carvel Hall. Armbruster's daughter, Ann Fosnecht, later said that Rosé included Marcellus Hall and other locals in many of his mural scenes. A hotel brochure published about the murals says this about them. It had long been the dream of the owners and the manager to help preserve in Annapolis and in Carvel Hall the essence of the past. Unless some concrete record existed, the possibility of actually restoring to Annapolis its vanishing glories and of preserving a visual record of what existed at one time was growing more remote with the years. Realizing this, it was decided to have Mr. Rosé place on the walls of this hotel, so long identified with the history of Annapolis, a delineation of the architectural beauty of the town at approximately the peak of its perfection. Mr. and Mrs. Rosé had many times visited Annapolis, loving its paintable quality, its air of antiquity, and its unspoiled charm. The acquisition and preservation by St. John's College of a number of historic mansions was in itself an inspiration. The restoration work at Williamsburg made hope for Annapolis grow apace. The organization of a company intent on a similar restoration of colonial Annapolis and the growing realization that there was a great need to guard what still existed lest it perish gave impetus to the project. Now, by this time, the CRCA had really fallen into a long period of decline and was not active at all. And I think what the Armbrusters and the McCarthys were doing with the Rosé murals is they were trying to preserve on the walls of Carvel Hall the look and feel of colonial Annapolis, because it was starting to look as if the real three-dimensional remnants of colonial Annapolis might not survive for all that much longer. And so they were trying to at least preserve the look on the walls of the hotel. The Rosé murals included scenes showing State Circle up top there, St. John's College on the bottom, City Dock and the shoreline from the colonial governor's mansion to Windmill Point. This is obviously the plot of land that became the Naval Academy property. City Dock down there on the bottom. He had scenes of Bryce House, Hammond Harwood House, Chase Lloyd House, and the William Paca House, but with that Carvel Hall portico over the door. And this African-American groom holding the horse is thought to be a depiction of Marcellus Hall. Paintings here of Patrick Craig House, Reynolds Tavern, and the burning of the Peggy Stewart. Now, fortunately, all of these murals still survive. We have them in a storage facility. They are not in very good shape, but we do have them, and hope is that they may be restored someday and be able to put on display again. Willis Armbruster was very impressed with the work of Marcellus Hall. He wrote, "Marcellus was on speaking terms with more celebrities, great and small, than all the rest of Annapolis put together. Naval officers at sea for a year or two, returning to Annapolis and Carvel Hall, were delighted to discover that Marcellus remembered them by name. More important, he never failed to quickly notice any change in rank that had occurred in the interval. Senators and representatives from Capitol Hill, movie stars and radio artists, even a few foreign dignitaries were on Marcellus's private list. All guests were entitled by rank, position, or past experience, as the case might be, to special consideration. Of course, Marcellus's memory proved to be a financial asset of no mean proportions. He made guests feel at home and counted his friends by the hundreds." As the social headquarters of the Naval Academy, Carvel Hall housed the chaperoned drags of midshipmen who took the train from Baltimore for hop weekends. The hotel hosted Saturday afternoon tea dances, or tea fights as the mids called them, where the midshipman to girl ratio was typically about 30-1. Marcellus Hall considered the mids his boys, and he called out all ashore that's going ashore as curfew approached on Saturday night. He maintained a close lookout for mids sneaking back in, wearing sweaters over their uniforms or climbing the fire escapes to get to girls' rooms. He said he never reported them to Naval Academy authorities because we were all young once, he recalled. Marcellus Hall remained the one constant as Carvel Hall changed ownership 5 times in 18 years, beginning in 1946. It was first sold to the Annapolis Sheraton Company, ending the long association of the hotel and the Pea House with the extended Larned family. After Sheraton sold it in 1950, later owners included 6 couples who formed the Craig Hotel Association, and then a corporate entity, Carvel Hall Incorporated, that was affiliated with the Naval Academy Athletic Association. So just as West Point has, Thayer Hotel, the idea was that the Naval Academy would have its own hotel, Carvel Hall, but that only functioned from 1960 to 1964 under that ownership. A second major fire struck the hotel in March 1951. This time it was started by a cigarette thrown into a laundry chute. Legislators working late at the State House, trying to finish up before recessing the next day, were allowed to adjourn so they could retrieve their belongings from the hotel. 4 companies fought the fire for 4 hours. 2 firemen were seriously injured when the kitchen floor of the hotel collapsed. And 4 others were hospitalized with smoke inhalation. Again, the Pea House escaped serious damage. And this is a wonderful photograph from the Baltimore Sun showing 3 of the ladies who resided at the hotel. The hotel had a lot of sort of transient rooms, people just coming to Annapolis for the weekend or the night or whatever, but they also had a lot of long-term residents. And so these are some ladies who were put out of their rooms for the fire. But this is the floor of the Pea House here, and then these are the steps that go down into the hotel addition itself. Many young people of the 1950s and 60s enjoyed, or endured as the case might be, their first forays into the adult world of ballroom dancing at the Annapolis Cotillion. Local historian Jane McWilliams recalls, "This was a formal evening dancing class for children from about 6th grade to high school, divided into 2 sections, hosted by Philip Richborg and his wife, taught by a man named Professor Cocky from Baltimore. The classes used the bottom floor garden rooms on the right of the entrance. It exposed hundreds of local kids, boys less enthusiastically than girls, to ballroom dancing and manners in what was, in that day, the premier Annapolis venue for formal affairs. We even got to use the ladies' room on the first floor, which had stalls that required money, unheard of in our small city at that time." By the early 1960s, Carvel Hall was showing signs of age and obsolescence. A survey noted it had over 200 rooms, but only 20 bathrooms, and no elevator. And there were rumors that the hotel might close and be sold. In January 1965, the Evening Capital proclaimed the Pea House must be preserved. Carvel Hall owner Dwight Allen of Alpha Enterprises said that he was willing to work with historic groups to a reasonable extent, but he was already in touch with potential buyers who were talking about demolition and redevelopment of the property. There was the threat of a multi-storied office and apartment complex which fueled community action. Historic Annapolis sat down with Allen, resulting in an agreement on a $125,000 purchase price for the Pea House itself. Historic Annapolis started a nationwide campaign to raise double this amount to buy and begin restoring the house. Historic Annapolis was founded in 1952, following the long inactivity of the CRCA. Its early accomplishments included the move of the Charles Carroll the Barrister House from Main Street to the St. John's College campus, and the restoration of Shiplap House on Pinckney Street. Historic Annapolis led the 1962 campaign to stop the Naval Academy from expanding into 3 city blocks containing historic structures. But the restoration of the Pea House was much bigger in scale and ambition than any project it had undertaken so far. The Pea House, the front terrace, and a 12-foot width along the rear of the house were sold to Historic Annapolis in May 1965 for a $10,000 down payment, and then the organization had 6 months to raise and pay the remainder. Fundraising proceeded well, with $276,000 received by the beginning of 1966. The state of Maryland then bought the hotel addition and the rest of the property. So the restoration of the site was really a joint project. Historic Annapolis having the house, the state having what became the garden, but working in concert. There was a dinner in late June 1965 in Carvel Hall to honor Marcellus Hall, who was now retiring after starting work there in 1913. The dinner was attended by over 230 people, including the governor, J. Millard Tawes, who had named Marcellus Hall Admiral of the Chesapeake Bay. Hall wore his hotel uniform with 10 stars, each one representing 5 years of service at the hotel. Hall said, according to a newspaper article when he was asked to get up and speak to the crowd, "Well, here I am. It took me a long time to get up to this head table, but as the eagle in the lobby says, don't give up the ship." As for Carvel Hall, he continued, "Maybe someone will still want the old place. I say, don't give up the ship. I'm going down with her." and he then turned the key in the padlock to mark the hotel's official closing on July 1, 1965. There was an auction of Carvel Hall furnishings 2 weeks later, with Marcellus Hall presiding. Admirers bought him the white wicker chairs that had stood in the courtyard for years. They were the only things that had been at the hotel longer than him. And they also bought him the golden eagle with the phrase, "Don't give up the ship," that hung in the lobby for many years. Mayor Pip Moyer put Marcellus Hall in charge of the city parking garage and named him to the first Historic District Commission. Hall later went on to start his own walking tour business, and he died in December 1971. Historic Annapolis has a small collection of Carvel Hall artifacts, including the taproom sign painted by Jack Rosé, who wrote to advise about the best way to remove his murals from the walls before the hotel building was demolished. There are some conflicting stories at Historic Annapolis about how the Rosé murals were taken out of the hotel. There's a newspaper article which recounts how St. Clair Wright, one of the founders of the organization, spent 4 12-hour days very carefully steaming the murals off the taproom walls. But another longtime board member, Lanny Rideout, says he and a couple other people worked them off the wall with an old saber. So whether it was careful steaming or just brute force, probably some combination of the two. St. Clair Wright was the lead cheerleader and coordinator of the Paca site restoration, but it was brought to reality by the contributions and work of many donors, volunteers, contractors, and professionals. Historic Annapolis hired James Wood Birch as the restoration architect. He prepared drawings showing the house as it stood when Carvel Hall closed. The basic footprint of the property was only slightly modified from William Paca's time, but the 3D massing has been considerably altered from its original configuration. Meanwhile, again, the state of Maryland bought the Hotel Addition and the remainder of the surrounding property to protect it from redevelopment. And working together, Historic Annapolis and the Maryland Historical Trust restored the house and garden as complementary parts of a single site. Some more drawings showing the house as it stood when the hotel shut down. This is sort of looking through the house from end to end, showing how the house was connected to the Hotel Addition through these series of stairs. Those ladies we saw put out by the fire were sitting on these steps right here. So this is now showing the hotel being mostly demolished. Just a little bit still connected to the back of the house. Now the hotel is completely gone, and the house is starting to be repaired and restored. Some architectural drawings done at the time showing the changes of the house through the years, and then also archaeology that was conducted in the late 1960s. The archaeologist who did that project was Stanley South. He wrote later on that the knowledge that can be gained by archaeologist, architect, and historian working together on a project at the same time, when they daily communicate extensively with one another, produces a climate of exacting workmanship and scholarship, unequaled by any other method of correlating the information gained from each of these 3 disciplines. Demolition of the post-18th century portions of the house began in August 1969 and were completed in March 1970. The exterior restoration stretched from July 1970 to October 1971. Preparatory work for interior restoration went from December 1971 to June 1973, and the interior was sufficiently completed to allow the house to be open to the public on July 4th, 1976, the bicentennial of William Paca's vote to improve the Declaration of Independence. So this is what the front of the Paca House looked like when Carvel Hall shut down, and then through the magic of PowerPoint, what it now looks like, with those later changes erased. And some interior shots here. This is in the main passageway on the first floor during the Carvel Hall period. And then as it looks now. This is the second floor passage during the hotel period. And as it's been restored. Then the parlor during Carvel Hall's occupancy. And as it's been restored. Total funding received to cover the costs of acquisition, research, and restoration of the Pea House was calculated at just under $1.75 million in 1978. This was significantly more than originally projected, but well worth the final results. And so now in 2015, this showplace of colonial charm in Annapolis looks more like the William Paca House and Garden of 250 years ago than it does the Carvel Hall of just 50 years ago, when the hotel welcomed its final guests. But there are still many local people who fondly remember its years as a hotel. Happy to take any questions if anybody's got one. Yeah, Grant.
Do you know if the museum, maybe Jim knows as well, if the museum ever loaned anything to Carvel Hall?
I don't know.
Furniture or anything?
I don't know.
No, but I'm gonna show Glenn after this is over with 2 paintings that came out of Carvel Hall that are in our boardroom.
Probably acquired at that auction?
They belong to the McCarthys.
Oh, okay, wow.
And they were willed to us in their estate. He was the color man, by the way, color company commander in class of '97.
Yes?
Just kind of interesting, I'm Larry Clemens from the Nimitz Library. I recently had a request from Baltimore. They were looking for a copy of a segment called Marcellus Takes a Walk.
Uh-huh.
And I found out that I have the only known 16 millimeter print copy, and it's Marcellus Hall giving a walking tour of the Academy. And I have converted that to DVD if you were.
Wow. That would be wonderful. I've heard of it, but I've never seen it.
So
How long is that? That's
Now
true.
you're asking me detail.
I don't know if it was a half hour or 5 minutes or.
Man, now, I think it's probably more along the lines of like 20 minutes. It's in black and white.
Yeah, he wrote a city guidebook in the 1930s, which he sold for, I think, $0.25 originally at the hotel. So he had a little money-making business going on the side there. And then, as I said, he later on started his own guided walking tour company here of not only the city, but also the Naval Academy.
He's wearing that admiral's uniform, and
Yes.
he introduces himself as the Admiral of the Chesapeake.
Yes,
The
yeah.
first Sunday I had duty here at the museum, I just happened to look out the window and I saw this distinguished gentleman with an entourage. And he was in that uniform. And I thought, oh my God, here comes the chief of naval operations. Country, they didn't tell me he was coming. Now what am I going to do? You know, he walks in the lobby of the museum, turns around, gives them a grand speech about the museum and what they're supposed to look at. Who the heck is that?
You're thinking, who is this 10-star admiral? Yeah.
He was in his Admiral of the Chesapeake Bay uniform. I also knew his widow, cousin Josephine. She used to stay with Lily Mae Chase at 22 College Avenue. And I knew Josephine was there when I opened the door and smell of Ben Gay. Cousin Josephine's here.
Yeah, Marcellus Hall was very important in the African American community. He got a lot of young people their first jobs at the hotel. I met a woman at the Bates Center. They also have housing there for retired folks, and I met a woman there a couple years ago, and she said she had worked for Marcellus Hall as a very young woman, I guess a teen, and his policy was if you came and put in a good day's work, he would always have a place for you. And she said, you know, when she finished her summer job, he let her know, hey, you've been a good worker, and if you ever need to come back, you're welcome. So he was very well respected for getting a lot of people their start on their career.
The history of segregation as it pertains to Carvel Hall, was it ever desegregated, or?
I
As far
don't.
as African Americans being guests of the hotel.
I have not seen anything about segregation of rooms. I really don't know if they were officially or unofficially segregated, or if just
And
African
Annapolis
Americans
was
didn't
just
stay
integrated
there.
when the
Yeah.
hotel was closing.
But
High
it's-
school was integrating in the late 60s.
But, you know, it's largely the behind-the-scenes staff, the kitchen staff, the laundry staff, the wait staff, you know, the porters, the bellboys, you know, all African-American. And Marcellus Hall is really that public face. He's the one who gets the notice of the guests and you know, the celebrities coming in. But he's really sort of representing everyone who's working behind the scenes. But he shows up in national magazines. One of the photographs I showed there earlier was showing him waiting tables. You know, that was in a national magazine, 1947. Sort of unheard of for African Americans to be depicted in that way at that time. Any other questions? Yes.
There was one slide that had a newspaper article, I guess it was when the hotel was closing, and it said there would be a new hotel erected near the stadium, a new Carvel Hall hotel. Was that ever done?
No, I think the Academy looked at several options through the years of where else could they put a hotel. There was, thought of putting one over near the stadium. I think there was talk about maybe something over at Eastport at some point, or actually on the yard over by, I guess, the visitor center area now. Never happened.
Yeah.
All right, well, thank you for coming out.